Moving into our presentation, beginning with an introduction on the Office of Generic Drugs Global Affairs and International Engagement. This will be provided by Dr. Sarah Abraham, Associate Director for Global Affairs, Office of Generic Drugs, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, FDA. Next, we'll learn about FDA and EMA's Parallel Scientific Advice Pilot Program for Complex Generic and Hybrid Products by Dr. Lei Zhang, Deputy Director, Office of Research and Standards in the Office of Generic Drugs, and Calliope Sarago, Lead Project Manager in the Office of Research and Standards in OGD. Our third presentation is on the EMA and International Engagement for Generic Developments by Dr. Kevin Blake, Senior Scientific Specialist, Clinical Pharmacology, European Medicines Agency. And our final presentation is on the use of foreign comparators in bioequivalence studies for Health Canada by Dr. Scott Appleton. Manager, Health Canada, Division of Biopharmaceutics Evaluation 1, Bureau of Pharmaceutical Sciences, Pharmaceutical Drugs Directorate, Health, Food Products, and Food Branch. Please join me to welcome our first presenter, Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm Sarah Ibrahim, the Associate Director of Stakeholder and Global Engagement, and today we will dive into unlocking global access to generic drugs. Generic drugs have saved billions over the last 30 years, contributing to access and affordability in healthcare. The cost of medications is a rapidly growing healthcare expense, influenced by higher prices of innovative medicines and increased prescription use due to rising rates of chronic diseases. Despite increases in brand name drug prices, generic medications have experienced price declines. Challenges in the generic medication landscape include falling profits for manufacturers, supply chain issues, and instances of price hikes by profiteers. Encouraging the development of generic substitutions to brand medications is crucial for sustained savings and access. The overall goal is to use healthcare funds more wisely, with generic drugs playing a vital role in affording necessary treatments and fostering innovation. In 2022, patients and taxpayers collectively saved $408 billion, a notable increase from the previous years of $373 billion in savings from generic and biosimilar medications. This trend reflects ongoing savings within the U.S. healthcare system benefiting patients. Over the past decade, generics and biosimilars have contributed to overall savings of $2.9 trillion. Despite filling 90% of prescriptions in the U.S., these medications only account for 17.5% of prescription drug spending. In fact, generics represent a mere 1.5% of total U.S. healthcare spending. Price competition among generic drugs help control costs, making medications more accessible, offering a cost advantage. Now, this affordability promotes medication adherence and reduces financial barriers to treatment for both patients and healthcare systems. However, cost savings are not the sole criterion for evaluating the value of generic drugs. Generic drugs play a pivotal role in strengthening the pharmaceutical supply chain and improving patient access. The presence of generic options stimulates increased production by multiple manufacturers, preventing reliance on a single source for a particular medication. This not only fosters market competition, but also ensures a broader, more stable supply, diminishing the likelihood of shortages. The diversity of manufacturers in the generic drug market contributes to supply chain stability by mitigating the risk of shortages caused by various challenges. The availability of diverse formulations also provides flexibility during shortages or disruptions in the supply chain. Overall, the multifaceted contributions of generic drugs play a crucial role in mitigating risks, stabilizing the supply chain, and enhancing patient access. OGD's efforts focus on streamlining regulatory processes, providing guidance, prioritizing complex generics, and collaborating with stakeholders to promote competition and increased access to affordable generic medications. These initiatives play a crucial role in removing barriers to generic drug development and market entry, ultimately benefiting patients by expanding access to essential medications. Diverse regulatory expectations pose challenges for generic drug manufacturers. The competitive landscape further complicates matters as thin profit margins and continual price erosion strain the financial sustainability of generic drug businesses. Dependency on a limited pool of active pharmaceutical ingredient suppliers leaves manufacturers vulnerable to supply chain disruptions. Legal battles over patent disputes with brand name companies delaying market access while navigating the complex legal environment surrounding generic drugs represent ongoing challenges. Now, insurance compliance with good manufacturing practice is paramount, with failure risking regulatory repercussions and product recalls damaging reputation and finances, considerably causing negative publicity stemming that undermines public trust. Exploring international markets offers fresh aspects for generic drug manufacturers to reach diverse markets. Participation in the global market fosters healthy competition, encouraging manufacturers to adopt more competitive approaches. Forging partnerships with international pharmaceutical firms and distributors amplifies market presence and distribution capabilities. Presenting a varied array of generic drugs addressing different therapeutic needs caters to regional healthcare disparities with specialized medications such as complex generics, offering added value and distinction. Efficient management of the global supply chain minimizes disruptions and ensures a consistent flow of materials and products, and reducing planning redundancies with manufacturing and distribution capabilities. Integration of cutting-edge manufacturing technologies streamlines the production process and enhances the quality and efficiency of generic drug manufacturing through automation and digitalization. Now, alignment of regulatory standards worldwide simplifies the approval process for generic drugs, cutting down on time to market delays, facilitated by active collaboration with regulatory agencies across different regions. Complex generics offer higher value and differentiation in several key areas. These medications feature advanced formulations that represent significant therapeutic advancement compared to simpler generic alternatives. Enhanced efficiency stemming from improved drug delivery systems and novel formulations leads to better patient outcomes and elevates their perceived value. Complex generics often enjoy extended market exclusivity due to limited competition resulting from the intricate nature of their formulations. Regulatory incentives further support this exclusivity, encouraging manufacturers to develop and approve complex generics. Capturing market share becomes feasible through the therapeutic advantages offered by these medications, which appeal to physicians and patients alike. The development of complex generics also presents opportunities for research and development, driving innovation within the generic drug industry. Manufacturers can strategically leverage these medications to manage product life cycles, extending their relevance in the market. Addressing unmet medical needs is another crucial aspect, as complex generic products provide cost-effective alternatives to other medications and ultimately improving patient access. Harmonization in drug development, the alignment of regulatory standards, processes, and requirements across global regions plays a crucial role in fostering a more efficient and equitable healthcare system worldwide. Consistency in regulatory standards reduces variability in drug approval requirement among countries, promoting common technical standards that streamline the submission and review process. Harmonization eliminates redundant requirements, accelerating drug development and approval timelines. That enhanced collaboration and information sharing enable global data exchange and mutual recognition of assessments, facilitating simultaneous market entry in multiple regions and addressing any supply chain disruptions. Patients ultimately benefit from access to innovative therapeutics, reducing any disparities in medication access, and harmonization of and strengthening of the global public health preparedness by streamlining process for responding to healthcare emergencies and supporting research investment. Regulatory agencies aim to harmonize standards globally, reducing duplication of efforts and promoting consistent criteria for approval of generic drugs. For example, regulatory agencies explore ways to recognize each other's inspections and cooperate closely, sharing knowledge for more efficient approvals. A big priority is making sure that generic drugs meet high manufacturing and quality standards to ensure that they are safe and effective. Agencies collaborate closely with pharmaceutical industry as well, encouraging open communication and teamwork to tackle obstacles and maintain a clear regulatory landscape. FDA established a multi-country forum, the Generic Drug Cluster, to achieve a common understanding of each member agency's generic drug regulatory requirements and to help increase scientific alignment. The FDA has established this forum in order to foster a shared understanding of generic drug regulatory requirements among member agencies and to promote collaboration. The cluster currently comprises of 7 regulatory agencies: FDA, EMA, Health Canada, MHRA, Swissmedic, Israel Ministry of Health, and TGA. It is the first forum dedicated to generic drug development established by the FDA in 2021. As I mentioned, the Generic Drug Cluster aims to enhance understanding of regulatory standards. In today's globalized pharmaceutical market, such collaboration is paramount, emphasizing the importance of shared knowledge and coordinated efforts to ensure consistency and efficiency in the drug development and approval processes. Recognizing the interconnectedness of actions across countries, collaboration emerges as essential. This collaboration established or enables early communication and fostering partnerships, paving the way for prospective discussions aimed at achieving convergence and harmonization goals. The discussions at the Generic Drug Cluster are supported by 21 CFR 20.89 confidentiality commitments. The systemic exchange of information and expertise among stakeholders forms the foundation of effective collaboration, promoting knowledge sharing and skill development. This exchange serves to improve the quality of information available, leading to more favorable outcomes. Now, to facilitate this process, we established procedures that are in place for proposing discussion topics, ensuring that collaborative efforts remain focused and productive. We additionally strict adherence to confidentiality agreements, safeguarding sensitive information shared during these exchanges, and we do foster trust among participants. Some key areas of discussion often include data sharing on regulatory approaches, highlighting both similarities and differences across jurisdictions. These discussions deepen the understanding of approval basis and scientific rationales behind regulatory decisions, further enhancing collaboration and promoting harmonization in the regulatory landscape. Topics are proposed through multifaceted approaches within the FDA's Office of Generic Drugs, and internally, OGD utilizes a Global Affairs Management Committee consisting of OGD leadership to deliberate on topics that are crucial for the generic drug cluster. In addition, an internal database has been established to facilitate topic submission from everyone in OGD. Now, externally, FDA initiates quarterly data calls to agencies within the cluster, promoting each agency to identify and submit a specific topic. This structured process enables a comprehensive coverage of relevant issues and ensures that the interests and perspectives of all stakeholders are considered. The generic drug cluster discusses approvability as well as current review challenges, regulations and guidances under development. Agencies have also agreed to share any data integrity concerns as well as extensive information sharing, particularly when data regulatory requirements do vary. We also anticipate generic drug pipeline challenges and any accessibility challenges due to emerging global regulatory changes. Regulatory agencies agreed to recurring regulatory updates. Agencies systematically review regulatory updates, conducting thorough gap analysis and identifying convergence opportunities that have tangible outcomes, such as improved access to medications, enhanced patient safety, and increased efficiency in regulatory decision-making. Since June of 2021, cluster meetings have been scheduled on a quarterly basis. However, there have been more than 16 cluster meetings convened, underscoring the necessity for ongoing dialogue beyond the originally designated quarterly sessions. Within the FDA, as I mentioned, an internal database has been established to centralize information pertaining to these meetings. This database serves as a repository for details regarding meeting agendas, topics addressed, resolutions reached, as well as the resultant impact of these discussions. The discussions within the generic drug cluster are paramount as they address crucial aspects of generic drug development, and approval. The topics are tracked and categorized, facilitating the efficient utilization of the intellectual assets and enhanced decision-making process. Topics as shown are diverse in nature, identifying and discussing regulatory pathways for the approval of generic drugs, including substitutability challenges across our jurisdictions, focusing on products that have no generic drug competition, and when bioequivalence requirements vary, and when modeling can allow us to bridge or converge our requirements. Sharing data from internal and external research that form the basis of these regulatory requirements. Regulatory agencies engage in discussions regarding variations in requirements, particularly for products exhibiting differences in bioequivalence study outcomes between healthy subjects and patients. Deliberations encompass distinctions between single dose as well as multiple dose bioequivalence assessments. The discussions aim to identify opportunities for minimizing patient testing while maintaining rigorous evaluation standards. During the discussions, various topics related to regulatory approval for complex generics were addressed, highlighting the variations observed across our different jurisdictions. Among some of the key focal points in the sharing of initiatives and pilots, such as the FDA's Model Integrated Evidence, or MIE pilot, as a specialized regulatory platform for industry to explore the proposed MIE approaches. The use of model-based bioequivalence approaches for the development of generic long-acting injectable products has been a highlight topic as well. Additionally, attention was given to assessing the bioequivalence of topical anesthetic formulations and the implementation of in vitro release testing for topical products. Case studies on foreign reference standards were also examined alongside discussions on data integrity screening tools employed to evaluate pharmacokinetic profiles. Cluster agencies also deliberated on the transition to low global warming propellants in anticipation of the upcoming global implementation, proactively anticipating the challenge transitioning requiring reformulation of inhalation products to use as alternative propellants, mitigating a period of adjustment during which some inhalation products may be temporarily unavailable, and ensuring continued access to inhalation products to patients. We collectively discuss and assess the impacts and implications of these global changes on our agency and its policies. What can the public expect from the cluster discussions? And I want to highlight some of the efforts and what you may be able to see in the near future. Some of the discussions have been the evaluation of oncology treatments, which was facilitated through collaborative efforts and cluster meetings, enabling participating agencies to gather and assess relevant data. Such collective assessment has the potential to streamline the approval process for oncology drugs, thereby addressing critical needs in cancer treatment more swiftly. Similarly, a consensus was reached regarding the gathering and assessment of data to evaluate the bioequivalence of mental health drugs. This agreement on combined data assessment may expedite the approval pathways for drugs aimed at treating mental health disorders. There was an additional agreement to share data on human testing, particularly in instances where differences exist between patient and healthy volunteer populations. The collective sharing of data could lead to harmonized recommendations for testing populations, potentially broadening the pool of test volunteers and accelerating drug approval timelines. Moving forward, our next steps involve expanding scientific exchange and identifying harmonization initiative opportunities. With a continued focus on complex generic drug products, we aim to enhance data sharing and mechanisms to facilitate this endeavor. By leveraging our collective resources and knowledge, we're committed to supporting a rapid response to public health issues, aligning with agency priorities, and advancing international initiatives. Our overarching goal is to safeguard the well-being of our patients and citizens while ensuring global access to essential medication.
Thank you for the introduction. Good morning. My name is Lei Zhang. I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Research and Standards in the Office of Generic Drugs at the FDA. Today, my colleague Khalil Bisarago and I will talk about the FDA-EMA Parallel Scientific Advice Pilot Program for complex generic and hybrid drug products. Here is the outline of my presentation. I will provide an overview of various international engagements to promote harmonization of B standards for generic drugs. I will also describe the scope of the FDA-EMA Parallel Scientific Advice PSA pilot program for complex generic and hybrid drug products. Describe what products are defined as complex products by FDA and as hybrid products by EMA. Also delineate the goals of the PSA pilot program, share what FDA has learned through the pilot, and finally, we'll describe a few tips for industry to participate in the PSA pilot. Following my presentation, my colleague Khalil Bisarago will discuss the PSA process in more details. As you heard in Sarah's presentation, FDA is committed to take steps to enhance and streamline the development and approvals of high-quality generic drugs by leading and interacting with multiple stakeholders, including other regulatory agencies, industry, and academia through various international engagements. Generic drug cluster and IPRP working groups are regulator-only venues for regulators to exchange information on issues of mutual interest, enable cooperation, and promote convergence of regulatory approaches. The bilateral interactions between FDA and other regulatory agencies can have a direct impact to help reduce redundancy and promote efficient generic drug development. The Parallel Scientific Advice Program is one of such programs that will be highlighted today. GBHI, a recurring conference, involves industry and academia to discuss topics to promote harmonization for B standards since 2015. More recently, the Generic Drug Discussion Group and ICH working groups are established to help prioritize and develop harmonized B standards under ICH. ICH is a unique platform to bring together the regulatory authorities and the pharmaceutical industry to discuss scientific and technical aspects of pharmaceuticals and develop ICH guidelines through scientific consensus. Historically, ICH guidelines have mainly focused on new drugs. It was not until about 6 years ago that we started to focus on scientific harmonization of bioequivalence standards for generic drugs with the publication of the ICH reflection paper on further opportunities for harmonization of standards for generic drugs in 2018. The reflection paper outlines a strategic approach for developing and enhancing ICH guidelines to support the harmonization of scientific and technical standards for generic drugs. It proposes to develop a series of ICH guidelines on standards for equivalence, demonstrated equivalence starting from non-complex dosage forms such as immediate release oral products to more complex dosage forms and products. The Generic Drug Discussion Group under ICH helped prioritize the topics to be brought to ICH for harmonization. ICH M13 is the first ICH guideline to harmonize BE for oral immediate release oral dosage form drugs. It is being developed in 3 series. The first guideline in the series, M13A on bioequivalence for immediate release solid oral dosage forms, was published. The draft was published in December 2022. It covers on BE study design and data analysis. The finalized guidelines is expected to be published in 2024 this year. M13B is under development, which will cover BE for additional strength, including the biowaiver for IR oral products. M13C will focus on data analysis and BE for narrow therapeutic index drugs and highly variable drugs, and also other complex BE study design and data analysis. In June 2023, ICH also endorsed the next new topic to be developed on BE for modified release products. The start date to develop this guideline is contingent upon when the draft M13C will be published. more topics on the complex products that need to be harmonized under ICH will follow. It is an exciting time for generic drug industry with these movements under ICH. The harmonized guidelines, once adopted by global regulatory authorities, would help streamline the generic product development and improve global access to generic medicines. Each ICH guideline development follows a rigorous 5-step process to build consensus, and it takes years of the efforts to develop and implement those guidelines. In the interim, regulatory agencies utilize other venues to seek convergence and have a direct impact on generic drug product development. The Parallel Scientific Advice Program is one of such venues. The Parallel Scientific Advice PSA pilot program between FDA and EMA for complex generics or hybrid products specifically focuses on complex products to support efficient generic product development and the regulatory assessment. This program was launched more than 2 years ago on September 15, 2021. It is an expansion to the existing PSA programs between FDA and EMA for new drugs and vaccines or gene therapies. Similar to the existing PSA programs, this new pilot allows applicants to have a trilateral meeting to engage in concurrent scientific conversation with both agencies on key issues during the development phase of their product. The reason it is a mouthful to say what products are covered under this meeting pilot is because there are differences in how FDA and EMA define and regulate those products under their jurisdiction. The goal of the PSA program is to support global development of these products that are harder to develop as generics or hybrid products under either jurisdiction. FDA's definition of complex products since Generic Drug User Fee Amendments or GDUFA II are those products that include complex active ingredients, complex routes of delivery, complex dosage forms or formulations, complex drug device combinations, and other products where complexity or uncertainty concerning the approval pathway or positive alternative approaches would benefit from early scientific engagement. You can see a few examples of the complex products on this slide under each of these categories. For a full description of what is considered a complex product, you may refer to GDUFA III Commitment Letter or FDA map on classification of complex products. Complex generic drug products are in general harder to develop with traditional bioequivalence methodologies, and many of them may require additional studies, including comparative clinical endpoint B study. Complex products in the U.S. have a significant overlap with hybrid products under EMA. Under EMA, hybrid products are those whose authorization depends partly on the results of the test on the reference medicine and partly on new data. For these products, although they consider the generics by US FDA, they are not generics under EMA, and they are hybrid products. They are usually submitted under the Market Authorization Application MAA Article 10.3 to EMA, not Article 10.1 for generics. On the other hand, some of the complex generics under FDA definition could be generics under EMA through their MAA Article 10.1 if the bioequivalence studies are sufficient to support approval. For example, the long-acting injectable products. For the purpose of the PSA pilot program, the product do not have to be both complex generics through FDA and hybrid products through EMA to be eligible. The program is mainly to focus on the products with complexity and can benefit by concurrent scientific discussion with both agencies early in drug development. So why we focus PSA for complex generics? Because some of the complex product, they need very substantive and the resource and the patient-intensive studies. If EMA and FDA have different recommendations, to duplicate those costs in both the EU and the US system is not optimal. And currently, we don't have harmonized guideline on complex generics. Through PSA, we can help increase dialogue between the two agencies and optimize applicants' global product development program by enabling them to discuss the specific questions concurrently with both agencies. And also, we can provide applicants with a deeper understanding of the basis for regulatory decisions from both agencies. And the process can help drive the convergency to help the applicants avoid the redundant replication or unnecessary testing as much as possible, as well as help shorten the time to drug development and approval by both agencies. Through the PSA meetings, generic applicants can gain an understanding of both agencies' recommendations on specific questions regarding the global development of complex generic drugs or hybrid products. Candidates for the PSA meetings include those product development programs that may benefit from the PSA process by potential harmonized approaches to reduce duplicative studies. Some good examples are for those products that may have different recommendations from the FDA and EMA in their respective product-specific guidances. The applicant may use the PSA meetings to determine whether a single study design might be acceptable to both regulatory agencies. The PSA meeting would help drive convergence so that applicant would not need to conduct multiple studies to satisfy both agencies' requirements. Other good examples include the proposals from the applicant for scientific approaches with data or information to support the use of a common comparator in B studies that are acceptable to both agencies, and also proposals to use modeling and simulation to improve efficiency of the development program. Now we have run this pilot for more than 2 years. There are several things that we have learned through the pilot. We did not receive a large number of the PSA meeting requests. 2 PSA meeting requests were granted and have gone through the PSA process. This low number may be due to the number of applicants who submit the generic drug applications to FDA and also the centralized EMA process may be limited. But we do think that the PSA program can be an opportunity to expand the number of generic drug applications that applicants that do submit applications to both jurisdictions. We also heard potential applicants may hesitate to participate in the PSA pilot program due to the misperception that conflicting advice from both agencies could require additional testing. There may be a lack of binding or enforceable commitments from the agencies could limit the value and impact of the PSA pilot, and also sharing the confidential information may potentially compromise the competitive advantages. However, we would like to say this has not been the experience of the pilot applicants, and these concerns may be unfounded. For example, we have safeguards for applicants to protect confidential or proprietary information through the confidentiality agreements and also the redaction of the sensitive data from the public documents. Throughout the pilot, FDA monitored and evaluated the program. And one feedback we received was that this is a learning experience for both the regulators and applicants to understand the differences in the process and the meeting expectations from the two agencies. The process does help convergence on science to address specific challenges. Overall, the pilot provided a unique forum for increased global collaboration, demonstrating long-term potential for both regulators and applicants. Immediate benefits were more visible to regulators than applicants. One lesson learned was that the designed process can be clarified and further improved. Recommendations to further improve the program based on the preliminary assessment include procedural clarifications, more clarity of the timeline expectations, and also develop best practices for meeting package preparation and participation. FDA has communicated with EMA to implement those key recommendations to further improve the PSA process. Here are a few tips for industry to participate. First, you need to know the process, where Calliope will present next. I hope today's presentation can help you understand better the benefit of the PSA program and its process. Second, you need to consider and be aware of the jurisdiction differences between FDA and the EMA and what are the key challenges that may cause redundancy in your development program. Third, it would be good to define the purpose to optimize trilateral FDA and EMA meeting expectations. Finally, it is important to work closely with project managers along the way, as there are many coordination needed to navigate and keep the communication across all involved parties, both within and outside of both agencies. I would like to conclude with a few take-home messages. The PSA pilot program is an important opportunity for the generic drug industry to leverage the expertise and experience of both agencies to optimize their global generic drug development program. Through the PSA process, generic applicants can gain an understanding of both agencies' recommendations on specific questions regarding the global development. The PSA pilot is ongoing to accept more meeting requests so that areas of improvement can be identified to support future recommendations. It is a voluntary program. We highly encourage applicants to participate. We are mostly interested in submissions that have the potential to reduce duplicative studies for complex generic products. Later, we will also hear perspectives from our EMA colleague, Dr. Kevin Blake, on this program. On behalf of OGD, thank you. Now I will turn over to Calliope, who will present the PSA process.
Thank you, Dr. Zhang. Hello, my name is Calliope Sorego, and I will continue our discussion on the Parallel Scientific Advice Program, specifically from the process standpoint. Our learning objectives for today are outlining the Parallel Scientific Advice PSA process flow and timeline, describing advantages for submitting your PSA meeting, preparing your PSA meeting request package, scheduling your trilateral PSA meeting, and understanding communications between FDA and the prospective applicant. The PSA refers to an EMA FDA program that provides the exchange of views on scientific issues during the development of your drug product. The Scientific Advice Working Party, SAWP, is a standing working party to the Committee of Human Medicinal Products, CHMP, at the EMA. The SAWP team assigned to a PSA will be a multidisciplinary group of experts with similar composition to the FDA multidisciplinary team assigned to your PSA meeting request. The PSA process for complex generics hybrid products is designed to align the process and timeline of FDA's pre-ANDA product development meeting as much as possible with the process and timeline recommended by EMA's Scientific Advice Working Party for their Scientific Advice SA process. This slide gives us an overview of the PSA timeline, which is broken into 3 stages. I will cover each stage with additional information in future slides. Stage 1 is where your meeting request will be assessed. During this stage, you will submit your PSA request letter to FDA and EMA. FDA and EMA will independently assess and decide within 14 calendar days to either grant or deny your meeting request. Once granted, a prospective applicant should submit a draft meeting package for review and validation by EMA. This is generally done approximately 30 days prior to submission of your full meeting package to both EMA and FDA. Stage 2 of the process begins once your full meeting package has been validated and received by both FDA and EMA. This stage is where your meeting package will be assessed by multidisciplinary teams from both FDA and EMA. This stage generally takes approximately 120 calendar days. At approximately 90 days, FDA and EMA will hold a bilateral meeting to discuss responses to your inquiries. Approximately 14 days prior to your trilateral meeting, EMA will issue a list of issues for discussion and FDA issues preliminary responses. Generally, by day 120, FDA, EMA, and the prospective applicant meet at the trilateral meeting. These meetings are generally held as a video conference. Stage 3 begins once the trilateral meeting has been held. Generally, within 30 days, FDA will issue final official meeting minutes, and EMA will share a CHMP final advice letter. Let's move to talk about some advantages for submitting a PSA meeting request. It will increase dialogue between the 2 agencies. Optimize global product development program by enabling discussion of specific questions concurrently with both agencies. Provide a more comprehensive understanding of the basis for regulatory decisions from both agencies. Drive convergency, helping avoid redundant replication of work or unnecessary diverse testing methodologies, and shorten the time to drug development and approval. Now that you have decided to submit a PSA meeting request, what should you do? Submit a single request for PSA letter, justification letter, to both EMA and FDA. Do not submit the same meeting package through both PSA and FDA's pre-ANDA program at the same time. Provide a statement indicating whether the submission is by the prospective applicant or by U.S. agent. And if not based in the U.S., please provide the U.S. agent information, including letter of authorization. Keep in mind your letter of authorization should be submitted on your company letterhead. What should you include in your meeting request? Some of these items may be familiar as they are similar to requests for submissions for a pre-ANDA product development meeting. In your justification letter, provide pre-assigned ANDA number, reference listed drug information, your application information such as brief history, status of your product development, contact person name and information, the applicant and/or U.S. agent, purpose and objectives, and why a meeting with EMA and FDA is beneficial, specific questions and supporting data and information. Your questions should be grouped by topics with each question clearly numbered. Provide a brief explanation of the context and purpose and supporting rationale or data. Anticipated submission date of your full meeting package if it's granted, and explicit authorization for the agency's comprehensive exchange of all information relevant to the product, including trade secret information as defined by U.S. statute. There's also a reference to information on requesting a pre-assigned number included in the slide. The PSA process, stage 1, 14 days. FDA and EMA will acknowledge, accept, and either grant or deny your meeting request. A PSA request does not guarantee that your PSA will be granted. For a variety of reasons, one or both agencies may decline to participate in the meeting. If not granted, a prospective applicant is free to pursue scientific advice with each agency individually. Your grant-deny decision will be generally decided 14 days from date of acceptance. If denied, FDA generally provides a path forward, such as pre-ANDA product development meeting or controlled correspondence. If granted between stages 1 and 2, a multidisciplinary team is assigned, and EMA will work with you to validate your meeting package. PSA process, stage 2, 120 days. This stage begins when a validated final meeting package is received by both FDA and EMA. By day 90, EMA and FDA meet to discuss your meeting package and come to consensus wherever possible. FDA issues preliminary responses and EMA sends a list of issues letter approximately 14 calendar days prior to the trilateral meeting. By day 120, a trilateral PSA video conference meeting is held between EMA, FDA, and the prospective applicant. Keep in mind there are currently no performance goals dates for the PSA program. However, FDA strives to meet dates as outlined in this presentation. Scheduling and holding the trilateral PSA meeting. Meeting dates are determined by annual SAWP meeting schedule and FDA assessment team availability. An FDA and EMA meeting project manager are assigned to assist with trilateral scheduling and prospective applicant communications. And both agencies strive to provide PSA responses that are convergent. The PSA process, stage 3, 30 days. You can submit a summary of the meeting discussion 7 days from the trilateral meeting date. FDA finalizes and issues meeting minutes, and EMA adopts and sends their CHMP final advice letter approximately 30 days from the trilateral meeting date. And after the PSA meeting, each agency retains its individual regulatory decision-making and provides the prospective applicant with independent advice on questions posed during the PSA meeting. Communications between FDA and the prospective applicant. FDA communicates and issues correspondence via email currently at this time. Will acknowledge receipt and acceptance of your submission. will issue either a grant or denial letter, and if granted, will issue a meeting information letter that contains meeting details. If needed, FDA will issue an information request letter, and keep in mind, FDA is generally the one that will issue the information request letter. FDA issues preliminary response letters approximately 14 calendar days prior to your trilateral meeting, and EMA will issue a list of issues. And FDA will issue your final official meeting minutes approximately 30 days after your trilateral meeting. In summary, a PSA meeting will help optimize your global product development program by enhancing scientific discussion of specific questions with both agencies. The PSA process closely models the pre-ANDA product development meeting and EMA SAUP process. The trilateral meeting is generally held within 120 calendar days of acceptance and validation of your full meeting package. And after the PSA meeting, each agency provides you with independent advice on questions posed during the PSA meeting. Both agencies will provide independent advice to the prospective applicant on the questions posed during the PSA meeting. While the potential benefit of submitting a PSA request is increased by convergence of advice, the two agencies' advice may differ. It is anticipated that following a PSA meeting, a prospective applicant will have a clearer understanding of each agency's respective requirements, and if divergent, the reasons for the divergence. I've also included a list of references for you. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and thank you to Calliope for that introduction. My name is Dr. Kevin Blake, and I am a scientific specialist in the translational science and the scientific advice offices at EMA. Firstly, disclaimer, the views expressed today are my own and not necessarily those of EMA. I would like to take the opportunity of this talk today to highlight some key points from the European perspective on the parallel scientific advice program. But I would also like to take the opportunity to highlight now that the EU regulatory network is very much based around international cooperation. There are a number of approval routes for generics in the EU, and these range from national, involving one member state only, through what we call decentralized or mutual recognition procedures, whereby one member state interacts with a number of others and takes the lead in the scientific assessment on behalf of the other member states involved. And also then there's the centralized route, which is coordinated by EMA directly, and any license that comes from such procedure is applicable throughout the European Union member states. And for generics, the majority by far are authorized via DCPs and MRPs. EMA scientific advice for generics is not just for centralized application and can also be sought for products that are intended to go through a DCP or MRPs. And similarly, for such procedures, there are also options for national scientific advice or simultaneous national scientific advice through a number of EU member states. Such advice is also applicable for centralized applications. The CMDH is the committee that coordinates DCP and MRPs, and if there are scientific issues blocking a particular procedure, the CMDH has the ability to seek scientific input from the CHMP. So again, all of these just emphasize how the EU regulatory network is based on cooperation between the member states. Now for the PSA itself, a number of key points from experience, and firstly to point out what we consider when we say that this is a pilot. This is aspect relates to the processes in place to implement the parallel advice between the EMA and the FDA, for example, the timelines or the various steps involved. But the actual scientific advice received is a full scientific advice to all intents and purposes, and therefore the usual fees and waivers apply at an EU level. An important point to make now is that the use of an EU reference medicinal product in the bioequivalence studies, which are used to obtain an EU marketing authorization, such a reference product use is a legal requirement, and as such, it cannot be circumvented, for example, through discussion of scientific aspects. Therefore, the PSA program for generics is not considered a forum to discuss the use of a non-EU reference product. And this is in line with the approach more generally from EMA to scientific advice, in that matters of a purely regulatory network are considered outside of the scope. Further key points is that we do have different regulatory definitions, and for the purposes of the program, the PSA will be available to those products where EMA and FDA's definitions overlap. Now, at an EU level, we don't have a formal or legal definition of what constitutes a complex generic, but in the principles that govern the PSA pilot, we refer to complex generics as being hybrid applications under Article 10.3 of the relevant directive. And effectively, these are products whereby the medicinal product does not, it cannot be readily shown that bioequivalence with the reference product. And this is most usually due to a difference in the pharmaceutical form between the test and reference. It may be that they're intended for a different route of administration, or they may also be, for example, different strengths. So what this means is that you can't actually show bioequivalence within the usual 80 to 125% acceptance criteria. So what you then move into is the need for an interpretation of clinical relevance of any observed differences in absorption or exposure. And such a discussion of clinical relevance may involve the need for additional preclinical or more commonly clinical studies in order to justify that any observed differences can be considered okay in terms of the safe and effective use of the test product. But it should also be clarified that for EMA, what can be considered conventional generics, and these we approve under Article 10.1, these are also eligible to participate in the PSA. They don't have to be complex in terms of being a hybrid application, but this can also apply to, for example, an intravenous injection or something that may be eligible, for example, for a bio waiver. And it's basically based on the nature of the products themselves. Now, maybe to expand a bit more in detail on these hybrid applications and how we see them in the context of the PSA, It's not to necessarily dwell on the regulatory aspects, but it is acknowledged from an agency perspective that applicants can see these hybrid products and the requirement for additional studies as being potentially off-putting. It is also to be noted that at a European level, for some hybrids, member states will not reimburse costs to the same extent that uh, generics will be reimbursed. But that's a separate issue for now. And basically, it's to point out that EMA sees this kind of hybrid route. The reason for it being there is to allow some innovation or some flexibility in the development of medicinal products that effectively builds on the experience with the reference, but allows for differences to be introduced. For example, new indications or new forms, as I've already said, and also maybe different strengths or different preparations that might target different patient subgroups. So this idea of flexibility is further carried through when we talk about hybrid applications. We talk about forming a PK bridge between the test and reference products as compared to meeting the set criteria for bioequivalence. And this bridge can involve a consideration of the clinical relevance of the different bioavailabilities. And so it's for these reasons that EMA considers the PSA could be particularly appropriate for programs that have these additional non-clinical or particularly clinical studies. And it could be that these studies are also required by FDA, albeit under a different kind of a US regulatory pathway. But the studies themselves might involve innovative designs or, for example, the use of modeling and simulation. And it is foreseen that through dialogue between EMA and FDA, it could be that there would be convergence for these studies. And I also just want to highlight this example. They're relatively few in number, but it can be for these hybrid applications that, for example, if some aspect of the PK is there's a gap in the knowledge, it can be that a study conducted with a US or FDA approved reference product can be considered supportive in terms of addressing that gap and therefore avoiding the need for this particular study or this aspect of PK to be clarified by studying an EU reference product. So to conclude, it's very much to emphasize that international engagement on generics is very much happening, and it really is considered that the PSA on generics presents opportunities for applicants. And in terms of any aspects of what I've said today, if there are any queries around the scientific advice procedures in the EU, you can contact the Scientific Advice Office at this email address. And then a reminder that the formal PSA request can be sent with a single justification letter to both agencies. Thank you. And if any more general questions, they can be addressed to the email through the link in this presentation. Thanks.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are located. I am Scott Appleton, and I will be speaking to you today on the use of foreign comparators in bioequivalence studies at Health Canada. I will start with a look at the Canadian regulations which permit the use of foreign comparators in bioequivalence studies submitted to Health Canada. For clarity, I'll be using the terms foreign reference product, or FRP, and foreign comparator interchangeably throughout this presentation. Next, I will provide a high-level look at how Health Canada have developed our approach over time. I'll touch on the general risks associated with using foreign comparators, and then I'll present a case study regarding some flexibilities applied based on risk and level of evidence. I will then briefly outline a few international collaborative efforts and end with a brief summary. Generic products are filed through the abbreviated New Drug Submission pathway, which was introduced into the Canadian Food and Drug Regulations in 1995. Shown here is the specific section C08001.1 of those regulations, where the Canadian reference product, or Canada's local comparator product, is defined. I'm not going to go through the entire definition shown here, but the relevant part begins with paragraph A, which defines the innovator product that is marketed in Canada. Next, the paragraph that is most relevant to the foreign comparator discussion lies in paragraph C. The criteria outlined in the guidance documents that I will be discussing are formalized in the regulations under what is considered quote-unquote acceptable to the minister in terms of specific characteristics and scope of products. As I mentioned, the regulations to support the approval of generic drugs were introduced in 1995 and were accompanied by the publication of a guidance document outlining the acceptance criteria. Canada was one of the first to accept foreign reference products in bioequivalence studies, and it was only a subset of products that were acceptable based on lower risk and complexity. Between 2000 and 2013, Health Canada sought advice from scientific advisory committees on the expansion of the scope of this guidance. The SAC did not support the expansion, as the members felt that the tests to establish identicality to the CRP for more complex products were less likely to establish that the foreign reference was identical to the CRP. Instead of presenting the long list of acceptance criteria, this represents the majority of the risk factors that the criteria were intended to eliminate. For low solubility drugs, the rate that the drug dissolves is driven by the addition of chemicals, which are typically surfactants. So this test is not considered to possess sufficient discriminatory power to determine that the FRP is identical to the CRP. And for modified release drugs, even the simplest modified release products have a coating that releases the active pharmaceutical ingredient, or API, under various conditions, whether it be pH dependent or exposure to stomach acid. Current testing methods are not considered to possess sufficient discriminatory power to permit a reasonable determination of identicality, nor do they provide information on how the drug substance will be released in vivo. Complex technologies such as OROS and other complicated pharmacokinetic release profiles further complicate that determination of identicality. And drugs with narrow therapeutic index and those deemed to be critical dose drugs in Canada are also excluded. The latter refers to drugs where small changes in dose may result in significant or life-threatening therapeutic consequences. And that includes such drugs as digoxin, theophylline, or drugs indicated for graft rejection such as tacrolimus. Now, it is recognized that there are limitations in establishing identicality to the local comparator. However, Health Canada was of the opinion that for the products in scope of the 1995 guidance document, even slight differences would be of no therapeutic consequence. And that leads us to the most recent development in Health Canada's approach to foreign reference products. In 2017, an updated draft guidance was published that included additional dosage forms that were not covered in the original 1995 document. The solubility definition was updated to a dose solubility volume of less than 250 milliliters over the relevant pH range. A notice was also published along with the draft guidance requesting substantiated proposals for further expansion of the scope, and to which no responses were received. In 2018, the guidance document was finalized following receipt of stakeholder comments. It was noted that no stakeholder comments were provided any scientific rationale for expansion of the scope of products beyond what was present in the 2017 draft. The 2018 finalized guidance document expanded the scope of products beyond the original immediate release solid oral dosage forms outlined in the original 1995 document. The additional dosage forms included immediate release inhaled dosage forms such as inhaled aqueous solutions, suspensions or dry powders, and immediate release nasal suspensions. The guidance document outlined the specific comparative testing requirements with regard to each dosage form. Now, there are risks associated with accepting foreign comparators, or the risks that are associated with accepting foreign comparators relate to any differences they have in systemic absorption relative to the local comparator. Typical bioequivalence criteria include the pharmacokinetic parameters Cmax, or the maximal concentration, and area under the curve, which is an indicator of the extent of absorption. By shifting the denominator of the test versus reference ratio for these parameters, the overall determination of bioequivalence has lesser relevance to the local market. In Canada, a declaration of equivalence to the CRP is given when a product is approved via our abbreviated pathway. This declaration of equivalence is used by provincial and territorial governments within Canada to establish interchangeability with the CRP at the pharmacy level and determine the reimbursement for the relevant products. There are instances where sponsors have provided sufficient data for specific products that permit the use of a foreign comparator that possesses one or more risk factors determined to be problematic in establishing identicality to the CRP. The following is a case study where flexibilities were applied due to additional considerations. It involves a prolonged release suspension that dissolves slowly following intramuscular injection, and this can be attributed to the low aqueous solubility of the API. It is then hydrolyzed to the active metabolite, which then is absorbed into the systemic circulation. The dissolution rate at the injection site is the rate-limiting step for the absorption, and the complexity with respect to the modified release component was not related to the formulation itself, but rather the inherent properties of the API. So, and just to summarize, it's a long-acting injectable for the treatment of schizophrenia. It has a long terminal elimination half-life. The risk factors that it possesses is that it's a modified release and has low solubility. And the bioequivalence study that was conducted at a large number of clinical sites and involved the enrollment of a large number of patients. The confidence intervals for AUC and Cmax were very narrow and included unity. And this study used the foreign reference product. The applicant provided the results of analytical studies comparing the CRP and the batch that was of the foreign reference product that was administered in the bioequivalence studies, or the biobatch, and that demonstrated their similarity, including physicochemical dissolution release, particle size distribution, and morphology. The applicant also included a letter from the local regulatory authority stating that the proposed generic product was found in a preliminary determination to be Q1 and Q2 to the foreign reference product, or the local comparator in this case. Some additional considerations, one being the ethical and practical challenges of conducting an additional study in patients with schizophrenia. And there were other factors influencing the risk versus benefit analysis that would require an additional bioequivalence study. And these include the large number of patients that would be required, and the nature of the disorder, meaning the difficulties associated with the management of the patient's illness and the long duration of a patient exposure to the investigational drugs. Any remaining uncertainty regarding the possible differences between the FRP and the CRP was not considered to be sufficient to justify requiring the sponsor to conduct an additional study in patients with schizophrenia for the purpose of obtaining a direct comparison of the test product to the CRP. There are several efforts on the international level. For example, the IPRP, or the International Pharmaceutical Regulators Program, have published 2 papers regarding the regulatory requirements for acceptance of foreign comparators and the criteria used in alternative comparator selection. Also, under the Access Consortium, which includes Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, and Singapore, there is the Generic Medicines Work Sharing Initiative. The latest operational procedures for this initiative are to be published and will include an appendix on acceptance criteria among the consortium members for those manufacturers that are considering filing any of those jurisdictions. To summarize, the use of foreign comparators allow generic pharmaceutical companies to leverage bioequivalence studies conducted for other jurisdictions. This is intended to reduce development costs, which are typically offloaded to patients, and it avoids the unnecessary exposure of subjects in additional bioequivalence studies. The applicable criteria are used to identify eligible foreign comparators where the risk of undetected differences are not likely to be therapeutically significant. And finally, the flexibilities to these criteria may be applied on a case-by-case basis. If you have any questions beyond the upcoming panel discussion, please direct them to the following email address. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for those great presentations. At this time, we'll give our panelists a few moments to activate their mics and then also turn on their videos to get ready for the panel discussion. We'd like to take this opportunity to welcome back Dr. Sarah Ibrahim, Associate Director for Global Affairs and OGD, to serve as our moderator for the panel discussion. Looks like many of the panelists are now coming on and just about connected with their mics and videos, and we'll give them just a few more moments. Join us as panelists. In addition to some of our presenters, we'd like to welcome first Lisa Burku, Senior Regulatory Counsel, Office of Generic Drug Policy and Office of Generic Drugs. Next, Ashley Bohm, Director, Office of Pharmaceutical Quality Policy in the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, CDER. Also, Dr. Robert Lineberger, Director, Office of Research and Standards, Office of Generic Drugs. And finally, Dr. Hongling Zhang, Division Director, Division of Bioequivalence 2, Office of Bioequivalence and OGD. Looks like we have everyone on camera and mic'd up. Now, please join me to welcome Dr. Ibrahim, our moderator for the panel discussion.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you for all the speakers and for the panelists joining us today. And we can go ahead and start the discussion. So the first one is a polling question for our folks. What are your greatest challenges in developing a generic product for global distribution? And this is for our audience. We always get asked, how can industry contribute? This is your opportunity now. Okay. Please keep the answers coming because that will be the opener for the panel discussion. So based on your experience, what are some of the greatest challenges in developing a generic drug product for global distribution? Okay. So obviously the number one so far is the different regulations and the different requirements. Different comparators, lack of harmonization. Okay. Thank you. Keep the answers coming. Lack of an ability to use a harmonized dossier. Lack of harmonization. It seems to be a consistent answer. Right. Well, so thank you, everyone. Jeff, can we go ahead and proceed with the upcoming panel questions? Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. The second polling question is, have you found the international harmonization on study design and bioequivalence criteria offered under ICH M13A to be beneficial to your generic drug development? The answers are yes, no, or you are not sure yet. We'll give it another few seconds. Okay. Okay. And I think we can go ahead and end the poll. Jeff, we can go ahead and display the panel questions. Well, the good thing is, yes, there seems to be an added benefit. All right. All right. So, and this is open for the speakers. Can you share examples on how regulatory agencies, including FDA, EMA, and Health Canada, collaborate on global activities for generic drug development? And how are these global activities integrated to maximize efficiency and outcome? Rob?
Thanks, Sarah. So, I think that there's a lot of activities where the agencies are working together, effectively. You heard updates on our generic drug cluster where we talk about this. We also, various agencies have guidances that, even before we go to the ICH processes, we look at each other's guidances. We try, especially in the product specific guidances, trying to understand what the origin of differences are and, get scientific alignment. Lay mentioned, Intertalk mentioned the GBHI, like scientific meetings where, where we and other experts come together and talk about like, well, why do you have differences? And, so a lot of those differences, as we discuss them and we gain insights from other agencies, there's some, natural sort of convergence that can happen even before you go into ICH processes. And, so I think there's a lot of activity where we're trying to be aware of what other agencies are doing and where we're giving potentially conflicting advice. And, at the end of this also, again, you've heard about the ICH processes for this, that's more, more formal harmonization process as well. But there's lots of activities that, have more immediate effects as well.
Thank you, Rob. Our panelists, any thoughts? Ashley?
Thanks, Sarah. I'm happy to say that, in the quality space, we continue to work closely with other regulatory authorities at ICH to move towards greater harmonization of some of those regulatory expectations. So, for example, there's ongoing work to revise the Q1 series of stability guidances in ICH, and I know that the group working on that is working on a broad scope, and so that will definitely include both brand and generic products. So I think ICH is, as has been mentioned, a really important place where we can help to drive some of that harmonization and hope to get to at least closer to a globally submitted dossier. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ashley. Scott?
Thanks, Sarah. So one of the things that Health Canada is participating in, or a couple of initiatives, include the Access Consortium. I think that's one of the bigger sort of work sharing initiatives for generics we're participating in. We also look at so maybe not necessarily, well, this is not for generics, but Project Orbis, which is for sort of new emerging oncology drugs, things like that. So the other thing is the IPRP. I think that's already been mentioned by Lay, but that's, I think, a big one that should also be mentioned, because it does talk about a lot of the harmonization and some of the opportunities that can be made for harmonization for various topics. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Kevin, would you like to weigh in from EMA's perspective?
Yeah, just to say that I think, and we've heard in the responses to the first poll question in terms of there being different regulations and different requirements around comparators and things, but I think, while we can acknowledge these, and I think the example of the parallel scientific advice, I think we're really trying to do as much as we can, particularly for these complex generics, which by definition we would anticipate would have more complicated development programs. So it's kind of trying to work, and particularly with a focus on the scientific aspects, and while not necessarily overcoming the other kind of regulatory hurdles, but at least trying to kind of optimize within the leeway that we do have to kind of obtain convergence. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And before we move up to our next question, do we have any further comments from our panelists?
Hi, Sarah. Maybe I can give a little bit more detailed information regarding the generic drug cluster meetings. I think Rob lists like a different platform for this collaboration. But for the generic drug cluster meeting, I think I can share some example topic we have been discussed, like for especially like when there's some special challenges in certain in vitro BE testing. So we bring to the meeting discussion all in the regulatory agencies. It's not only FDA-EMA and Health Canada. I think we have like 7 regulatory agencies. Everybody can bring their challenges and into the group and to discuss, and like a special in vitro BE testing, as well as some challenges in excipients or BE recommendation or statistical method. I think that's provide very good platform for this collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eileen. Perfect. The next question. So to our panelists, can you share new updates on guidances related to harmonized product descriptions, classifications, or dosage forms? And what would be considered next for harmonization in the generic drug arena? And what are the areas to further enhance collaboration?
Yes, Ashley. Thanks, Sarah. I'm happy to start if that's okay. I wanted to draw attention to work that's ongoing again at ICH. There's work ongoing to revise M4Q, which helps to outline the content and format of the quality section of a marketing application. And as that effort moves forward, as it gets to a stage where a draft will be issued and out for public comment, ICH intends to start work on a new effort referred to as structured product quality submissions, which will help to standardize how the data and information that would come in an application or a dossier should be structured. And this work will further enable a globally harmonized dossier, as well as on the FDA end will help support the work we've been doing with our CASA effort. That stands for Knowledge Aided Assessment and Structured Application approach, so we'll be able to more quickly and readily take in data and information from the dossier to facilitate a more efficient and consistent assessment process. So keep your eyes out. Later this year, we hope to see SPQS get started at the ICH level. Thank you.
Hi, this is Rob. So talk about talk about the future areas for harmonization for, specifically related to generic drugs. And, as you know, we have the M13 guidance, which is rolling down, and then there's some M13 B and C steps going further. And, thinking about what are the next steps in the bioequivalence harmonization efforts, the logical next step looks at modified release products. And then, there's a separate set of, more complex products, topical, inhalation, complex injectables, where there may be opportunities for harmonization. Again, those are more complex situations. But, I think an important part of this question is how can the generic industry contribute? And I think one of the things that, maybe I'm envious of things that Ashley and OPQ are doing, like the number of paths of independent areas where they're working on harmonization is really impressive, right? We're on stability, on submission formats and things like that. And, for part of the generic industry does the generic industry for generic specific topics have the capacity to engage on multiple streams of things in parallel? And what types of things might they be if you want to see more areas of this? Because I think, as we're beginning, and certainly in the bioequivalence area, we're not really sure. Is there enough capacity in both expertise from the different regulatory agencies and the generic industry to have multiple different streams running forward? And so we're really focused on making sure the M13 is a success. But I think that's an area to think about that has an important role for the generic industry. If there are areas where you see that are focused on the generic industry, is there interest to have the capacity to work effectively on more than one thing at a time? And that's an important, question for the future. And but it also will depend on how these different initiatives create value. Some of the things, certainly for quality, there's absolute overlap between the brand and the generic companies, but there are generic specific things for follow-on products to make that process more efficient. And so I think that's a challenge for the future. I think there's clear, and even just in the bioequivalence area, there's clear sort of next things that you can do that'll keep us busy for 5 to 10 years going forward there. But we'd like to look about other aspects of the generic drug programs and applications that can be harmonized. Like, Ashley mentioned, moving toward more consistent data formats, right? Is that something that's useful in other areas than quality? There already are submission standards in some places for the PK data, formats and things like that, that also, may touch on other areas, not just generics, but they may be more in alignment with what are the formats where you submit other types of PK studies to new and generic drug applications. There's efforts on model-informed drug development that can impact new and generic drug development that are different types of overlap. So those are areas where I think thinking about how the generic industry can be involved in those, and also, encourage the generic industry also to be involved in the, the quality guidances as well, because that's incredibly important to the generic industry.
Thank you so much. Any additional comments from our panelists? Lisa?
Sarah, if it's okay, I can take the last question about ICH guideline development and whether generic drug applicants have to follow ICH guidelines, which I know is a question that we do receive. And, as Lei mentioned in her presentation, we really do play a significant role in the development of ICH guidelines, which we then adopt and we issue as our own guidance for industry. So as part of that 5-step process, what typically happens is ICH will endorse a draft guidance and agree it should be made available for public comment, and we'll then issue that draft guidance in our fester in the U.S. government's Federal Register. That guidance will be considered by FDA and whichever ICH working group is working on that guidance. And once consensus is reached on that final guidance, ICH will again endorse it and will issue a final guidance. And by we, I mean FDA. And like any guidance, applicants are not required to follow ICH guidances. Rather, you can always propose an alternative approach if it satisfies the statutory and regulatory requirements for approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Any additional comments from our panelists? Scott?
Sarah, if I can add, just in terms of the EU, effectively, like as Lisa was saying, our guidelines aren't legally binding, but there is an expectation that they're met in line with there being regulators' expectations of what is required. And it's just for industry to be aware that once the M13A becomes finalized, we will have like a 6-month period here until it becomes effective. But it will mean that our current guideline, there will be parts of that which will be still applicable that are not yet addressed through the various steps B and C. So I would think industry should be particularly mindful of the meeting the requirements kind of potentially across the guidelines as a kind of a transitionary phase at least. Thanks.
And just to further that on the Health Canada side, we same thing. I mean, we want them to obviously meet the regulatory requirements. Guidance is not does not have force of law. However, we do have regulations and that they need to comply with. So the science needs to be in line with what our current scientific thinking is, and we do apply the current scientific thinking to our submissions that are or applications that are being considered at the time. So I just wanted to mention one more thing in the sort of on the what's next for harmonization. And I'm not sure if it was mentioned or not about the generic drug discussion group through ICH and how they developed a prioritized list of topics that will then are sort of next to be developed sort of in a queue, so that obviously modified release is next, and that's going to be in alignment with M13. But there are other topics that are falling beyond that, and industry did have an input in on that particular list through the representation through IGBA. So, but yeah, it's something that should be revisited going forward if people want more, to be more reflective of their current needs. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. And that takes us to our next polling question. Are or were you aware of the pilot parallel scientific advice program between FDA and EMA for complex generic hybrid products? The good news is the ones who were not aware are now aware. All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your response. Jeff, we can move to the next question. The next question, and it's an open-ended question. If you were aware, what are the main reasons that you did not participate in the program? Please type in your answers. Right. I think how you can find out that information is by attending talks like this one, workshops, this SBIA. We do publish all of our updates on FDA websites. In particular, global affairs and generic drugs, we do have a generic drug global affairs webpage as well that will provide you with all the updates. But you made it here, so that's one step closer to knowing more information. And we encourage you to continue being on the mailing list for SBIA events. Okay. Thank you so much for the answers. All right. All right, and back to our panelists. What are the FDA and EMA's perspectives on the continuation of the Parallel Scientific Advice Program? Kevin, do you want to take this one?
Yes, Sarah, it's just that it's good. Certainly my perspective has been helped by the response to that last question, because it would seem that, you know, there's quite a degree of lack of awareness of the actual pilot, which to some extent would explain, as Lee highlighted in her talk, the relatively low numbers that have participated to date. But I think that, and I think the overall feeling from today reflects the perspective that, you know, really it is something that kind of has been established. The couple of cases we've had so far show, as I was referring to, that the pilot aspect, you know, can be tackled. You know, it may be further fine-tuned in terms of the length of the timelines and things, but the actual kind of concept and the processes and getting results is something that seems, you know, to be established already. So it would be just to really emphasize to people, as you've said, if they can kind of increase their awareness, and we would encourage them. It can be difficult to take in all the different kind of regulatory speak and the likes, but we have all given various emails and links for people to follow through if they have queries, and we would really encourage people to participate. Thanks.
Thank you. Any follow-up from our panelists?
Yeah, this is Rob. Like, I think, I think, we'd really be interested in hearing from the industry on, what are the limiting factors in participating in this? And, part of it may be what products where, we know that sometimes there are regulatory reasons why you may want the timing of submissions may be different to different agencies. So we'd like to understand that, as well. I would say from FDA's perspective, I think we don't understand the differences between when generic companies may try to submit something to an individual country versus go through the centralized procedure to understand which products will really be attractive to a generic applicant to move into that way, and to understand how we might make the system work better in those situations if there are cases. But I think we want to understand a little better, like, what are some of the barriers from, because the program is really set up for something where you're going to submit something at approximately the same time to both agencies. So really understanding from the industry perspective what limits that access would be very helpful to us.
Thank you so much, Rob. And I think we've heard it from industry, and they've been quite vocal, even in the chat, that the use of a global or common comparator and a single development program approach, highlighting it is a challenge to pursue the parallel scientific advice. So what are the challenges and perceived barriers that regulatory agencies foresee? And how can we as regulatory agencies work together to reduce such barriers and promote global generic drug development? And of course, this will be a follow-up, and what are the scientific considerations in utilizing a foreign comparator for bioequivalence assessment and regulatory decision-making? And I think we've lost Rob, so any volunteers from the panelists to take this one first?
Scott? I can go first, Sarah. It's just, again, to acknowledge the idea of this EU reference medicinal product. And I think it's clear that to some extent that's a barrier. But as I've said in my talk, that is a legal requirement. And as such, it is, not something that can be negotiated around through a scientific advice or really regulatory submissions within the EU. But it is just to say that within the context, and that's why the parallel advice, we would see it as potentially presenting opportunities if the focus is on the clinical development. And it could be, for example, that studies are conducted with both, say, a US and an EU comparator, or it could be that some aspects of the development program that aren't directly concerned with comparative bioavailability or effectively bioequivalence, but that elucidate aspects such as fed state or the influence of multiple doses or the like, that it could be that clinical programs could converge in some aspects, albeit separate to the kind of pivotal bioequivalence aspects. But I think that's why we need to get the meeting requests in and to be able to kind of flex our brains as well around these approaches. Thanks.
Yeah, one aspect of this that also I think can be important to the generic industry. Maybe the goal for the generic industry might be to ensure that I can market the same product in both regions, irrespective of sometimes the studies that you may have to submit because of our current regulations. But if the parallel scientific advice allows you to make sure that from the perspective of the generic company, I don't have to make separate products or someone doesn't say, well, change your product this way, and the other agency says change your product that way to meet my requirements. That can be helpful as well. And so I think those type of questions can be in scope for the parallel scientific advice. How do I if there are things that may be leading you to say, well, look, it seems like FDA wants me to go right and the EMA wants me to go left. How do I come up with a global product, irrespective of things about which exact BE studies I need for which regions? But, and we also encourage, especially for more complex development programs where there's a lot of different studies. I think from FDA's perspective, when you put that full set of data together, there's maybe more flexibility because you conducted, if you have a complex generic and there's multiple studies and enough of those studies use both products, and you have data then that can provide a scientific bridge that says, well, look, the whole set of evidence that's acceptable, for FDA, we can conclude that you are bioequivalent to the US reference product based on all of the data that's included. And, that's much more possible in some of the more complicated, complex generics where there are, again, even in a normal just submission to the US, you'd have multiple studies, rather than if you come down to, well, a simpler product where there's one pivotal study and what do you do about that, then there's a little bit more like what extra information you need. But in the complex development programs where companies are conducting multiple studies at multiple phases of development, there's much more, I think, ability to come up with, all right, what's the set of data? Is the full set of data going to be scientifically acceptable? At least FDA, and you have to recognize that each region has some of their own different constraints, but FDA's regulations do have lots of places for waiving certain studies if there's appropriate evidence and science, that there is some possibility of some science, of scientific. But the important thing is you have to have the scientifically sound approach. Like that's the most important thing. If you don't have that, then trying to sort of argue into sort of clever ways around that. But you have to really have the scientific foundation of, look, here's the evidence that there's really that the global data works together, fits together, isn't completely consistent, and that's the important part. And I think the parallel scientific advice is really the place to have that scientific discussion around what studies, what do you learn, how does it all fit together into a program. We can't guarantee that you'll get the answer that you like. You have to work through the regulations and the specific situation. But I think getting the scientific foundation right is something that the parallel scientific program can do. And so we'd encourage applicants to use that and bring those questions where there are opportunities for significant savings and optimized development, to at least consider using the parallel scientific advice process to explore those options.
Thank you so much, Rob. And Scott?
Right. Thanks, Sarah. So just similar kind of scenario for Health Canada, to maybe a little bit more flexibility in our case, just because we do have some criteria that we would accept foreign comparators. So we would want to see, some of those criteria, or those criteria being satisfied in order to be able to accept that product. The key is to have upfront planning. So to have your plan in place, so that if your product has these characteristics, that you do the testing between the Canadian product or the local comparator product versus the product that you plan on conducting your clinical studies against, just because that will provide that bridge. And then it's actually quite important to have that particular batch that's used in those studies that provides a more direct comparison and greater assurance that you're going to have an identical product to the reference that's used in those studies. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. And Hong-Ling?
Yeah, I think for scientific consideration, the key factor is to understand the product. So each product, they have their own complexity, either API, excipients, or manufacture process. So considering scientific bridging studies, so you have to know your product and design the appropriate testing to compare the foreign comparator with your own comparator. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And our last polling question after today's webinar: how likely are you to consider participating in the Parallel Scientific Advice Program? Okay. While we're receiving all of the answers, I'd like to thank all of our panelists today. And once we close the poll, we'll go ahead and switch it over to Captain Rayford for the Q&A session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for the great panel discussion. As we give our presenters an opportunity to transition from the panel discussion to verify their mic connections, we'd like to remind attendees that if you haven't had a chance to submit your questions via the Q&A chat pod, please do so now. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. We do have some questions coming in right now, and the first few questions are directed to Dr. Sarah Ibrahim. And here is the first question for Dr. Ibrahim. What do you think are some of the biggest barriers in terms of harmonization and collaboration?
Thank you so much for the excellent question. And I would say the first one is that the regulations have already been established. And of course, those regulatory differences, variations in regulatory requirements between countries does hinder harmonization. There are legal and intellectual property issues that do pose some additional barriers in addition to resource constraints. The ICH work and our contributions to all of these international engagements are resource exhaustive. And then outside the scope of the regulatory agencies that we continuously collaborate with, there are some lack of mutual recognition agreements that can limit the reasoning behind particular regulatory requirements, and of course the setting the data requirements and standards, and of course the market dynamic would dictate that significantly. It is an exhaustive process. So it's one of the reasons why the generic drug cluster was launched, is that we can have dialogues and discussions prior to regulations being established, so we don't look back and wonder why harmonization has been such a challenge. Thank you.
And thank you for responding to that question. The next question for Dr. Ibrahim is the following. How is the FDA considering emerging markets such as Africa in the generic drug cluster?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the FDA does recognize the importance of engaging with emerging markets. And I think Africa was mentioned as an example. Obviously, with the fastest growing continent, there's a lot of eyes are on Africa as well. But I would say the first is capacity building and training. FDA does provide technical assistance, capacity building and training programs, in addition to information sharing and collaboration dictated by the Memorandum of Understanding or any confidentiality commitments that do exist. We do support efforts to promote regulatory harmonization and convergence of standards, and hopefully that carries over to regulatory agencies in emerging markets. And in addition to all of the public health initiatives that the FDA allocates resources with international organizations, governments, as well as non-governmental organizations on many of these public health initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. And this is the final question for Dr. Ibrahim in this round is the following. Are generic synthetic oligonucleotides included in global activities?
Thank you for the question again. And as I mentioned, we have a very active library and portfolio of discussions in the generic drug cluster. And I think in my presentation, we've already alluded to that discussion being in the generic drug cluster in the past 2 years.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. Moving on to the next panelist. We have a few questions that came from Dr. Lei Zhang, and here is the first question for Dr. Zhang. Does the reference drug need to be approved in both the US and EU to be submitted to the PSA, or if the reference drug is approved in only one of the either US or EU, can a manufacturer still seek approval through the PSA?
Thank you for the question, Ray. I interpret this question talk about reference product as the basis for the approval as mandated by the regulations in both EU and the US. For US, it is ROD, is our legal basis. As you heard from the panel discussion, I think there is a need to have approved reference products in both regions because it is a legal requirement by both agencies that the approval basis is the products or reference products approved in their respective regions. So this is the regulatory framework. You do need to have an approved reference product in both regions in order to seek the generic approval. However, we also heard the PSA does present opportunities for the applicant to propose the scientific approach to build a bridge. They should not really ask to use a foreign reference product or foreign comparator, but they could ask the question about how to demonstrate a scientific bridge to, for example, the US approved RLD by using other regions' reference product. I just want to clarify. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. The next question to Dr. Zhang. Dr. Zhang, can you shed any light on when the PSA program will be mandatory?
Thank you for the question. I just want to clarify that PSA program is just like other communication avenues that applicant can utilize to help facilitate their drug development. So it is an optional program. The applicant can decide when to utilize this program to help, depend on what question they have at the end for the development program. They can think this, hopefully from today's webinar, they can see the opportunities that may reside in their development program to seek concurrent advice from both agencies to help facilitate their development program. So it is not going to be mandatory, it will be optional. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. The final question for Dr. Zhang in this session is the following. Should we, if we're requesting a PSA, should we submit the drug product in Europe and the USA?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think the reason we encourage people to use the PSA process is the understanding that the applicant has the intention to submit or market the drug to both regions. So if that's the case, PSA program probably will be very beneficial, especially if they encounter some challenges by maybe there are different requirements from either agencies. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. Moving on to our next panelist, we've got a few questions that came in from Calliope Sarago. And here is the first question. What is a typical timeline for a PSA meeting in comparison to a pre-ANDA product development meeting?
I'm happy to address this question. Thanks, Ray. Although the PSA pilot program does not have performance goals, FDA does strive to keep the PSA timeline consistent with the timeline for a product development meeting. For example, we generally grant or deny both meetings within 14 calendar days from receipt of your request. We hold the meeting within 120 calendar days, and we issue our meeting minutes 30 calendar days after holding the trilateral meeting. Where the PSA timeline may differ from a product development meeting would be based on the amount of time it may take a prospective applicant to validate their meeting package and subsequently submit it, the full package, to both the EMA and the FDA. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. The next question for Calliope Sarago is the following. Can you elaborate on how EMA and FDA communicate during the PSA process?
Thank you, Ray. EMA and FDA share communication between the two agencies to coordinate your PSA meetings, such as scheduling the bilateral and trilateral meetings and issuing various correspondences, letters, and communication. Both EMA and FDA multidisciplinary team members will communicate prior to holding your the bilateral and trilateral meetings. And these interactions between the two agencies would increase dialogue and collaboration for a more effective trilateral meeting. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. One final question for Calliope Sarago is the following. Will preliminary responses from both agencies be shared with the applicant before the trilateral meeting? And if so, when will they be shared?
FDA will issue preliminary responses and EMA a list of issues letter approximately 14 calendar days prior to your trilateral meeting. These are issued to enhance discussion during your trilateral meeting. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to our next panelists, we've got a few questions that came in for Dr. Kevin Blake, and here is the first question. What would be the fees for the pilot PSA?
Thanks for the question, Ray. The fees effectively are, it's, as I said in my talk, it's the usual schedule for scientific advice requests. And basically this would be for an initial request that spans quality, non-clinical and clinical questions, which perhaps might be anticipated with a hybrid application. These would be approximately 90,000 euros. But for various scope, if, for example, you had a request with quality and clinical only relating to bioequivalence, then it would be in the order of 45,000 euros. And it's just to point out that there may be fee reductions applicable for small and medium enterprises that are registered in the EU.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a couple more questions for Dr. Blake, and here's the next question. As per the pilot PSA principles document, the information regarding research product identifier is required to be included in the meeting request. Could you please elaborate on what is RPI?
Thanks again for the question. Yes, indeed, this is a concept or a term that's unique to the EMA. And basically, we use this term to track medicinal products that come through our various pre-authorization procedures. So the first time that you approach EMA with a new medicinal product and you don't have a previously assigned RPI, then you need to request one through what we have called the IRIS platform, which is our online submission portal for scientific advice requests. So effectively, it's a kind of an administrative step that you need to do before you would request the PSA, and it's done through the EMA website. Thanks.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have one more question for Dr. Blake in this round, and this is the following. Is the EMA procedure number required to be included in the PSA meeting request?
No, the answer is no. And in fact, the procedure number itself, you only get that after you formally submit the request for scientific advice through the IRIS portal I previously referred to. So that's something that comes a little bit further after the request itself. Thanks.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. Moving on to our next panelist, we've got a few questions that came in for Dr. Scott Appleton. And here is the first question. Will Health Canada be part of the PSA?
Thank you for the question. There is some discussions that are preliminary discussions that are going on that we will look into any sort of collaboration on this front. Yeah, they're quite preliminary right now, so it's very difficult to say, but we are definitely open to that collaborative effort. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Got a couple more questions for Dr. Appleton, and here's the next question. What is Health Canada's position for the use of foreign comparators in vitro studies to support bioequivalence?
So for this, where there's in vitro studies involved, and specifically for products where it's in vitro only, for example, for kinetic binding studies for non-absorbed resins or products like this, we would require the local comparator or Canadian reference product be used, because otherwise it would be an indirect comparison, because they would then have to use the same studies to then show that the foreign comparator is the same as the CRP. So we want a direct comparison between the proposed product and the Canadian reference product. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have one more question for Dr. Appleton, and it is the following. Will Health Canada accept older bioequivalent studies conducted with a foreign comparator that meet the current bioequivalence acceptance criteria?
This is a good question. So one of our criteria for accepting a foreign comparator is that there is a comparison made between the bio lot, so the lot that was administered in the bioequivalent study, to the Canadian reference product or a local comparator, and this establishes that link, or that it's identical product, as per the paragraph C that I mentioned in my presentation. So in this case, it would be that unless these studies were conducted, that this comparison was conducted when the actual study was conducted, if it was an older study. One of the issues with older studies is that the biolots have been expired; they don't have them anymore. So this is why when I mentioned that, you know, a lot of upfront planning is involved in order to use this type of approach in submitting to Health Canada for these studies using foreign comparators. So thank you very much.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. Moving up to the beginning of our panel, we have a few more questions that came in for Dr. Sarah Ibrahim. And here is the first question. Regulatory agencies should harmonize first, and industry should submit an application at and on address.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think we can work concurrently, and ICH does include industry representatives as well, and who are actively engaged. There's a scope that the regulatory agencies can see, but without industry insight as we are moving towards harmonization, there will be elements that we will miss. So we do think that proactively engaging with industry early enough as we're developing these harmonization or moving towards harmonization does create a more effective approach to a more robust development program. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have a couple more questions for Dr. Ibrahim, and here is the next question. How is the cluster different from other international engagements such as IPRP, ICH, etc.?
Thank you for the wonderful question. And it is a question that we do respond to significantly. I think my dear colleague, Dr. Lei Zhang, had already presented on the different types of engagements. And many of these international engagements assess gaps in our regulations, assess opportunities for harmonization. And then other organizations that do develop these harmonization or harmonized guidelines. However, as I mentioned, these are assessments and ongoing evaluation of regulations that are in place. There are discussions in the cluster that cannot occur in other forums. The generic drug cluster is founded on the confidentiality commitments between our agencies that allow us to prospectively discuss guidances under development or under review. And that allows insight and scientific bridging between our regulations that otherwise would not have been an opportunity in other international forums. Additionally, we do in real time discuss review challenges. And again, another opportunity that is not allowed in many other forms. So we are actively engaged in other international engagements, mostly focused on gap analysis, opportunities for harmonization, and actual harmonization initiatives, versus the prospective harmonization and in real time discussions regarding review challenges or access challenges is exclusively for the generic drug cluster. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. A couple more questions just came in from Dr. Sarah Ibrahim, and here's the next question. How can industry propose topics to be added in the cluster?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the ways is that the topics that are get provided to us through some of the scientific advice seeking, whether it's through the parallel scientific advice or the pre-ANDA, or raised to us by direct communication, have actually made their ways through the generic drug cluster. So while industry does not have a seat in the generic drug cluster, they do have a voice. And we do, as regulatory agencies, when we receive inquiries or insight from industry, we do bring it into the generic drug cluster and actively discuss it. You may not necessarily see the impact immediately, but you will see it down the line.
Thank you for responding to that question. The final question for Dr. Abraham is the following. Do you envision the possibility of parallel reviews in the near future?
It's something that we can look forward to achieving. I believe regulatory agencies agree on one profound fundamental value, which is protecting and safeguarding our patients. And we will, in the cluster, continue to discuss on how it is that we can better improve our regulatory infrastructure, continue to engage so that we align to the best of our capabilities with the scientific data to support it. And hopefully one day we can actually, in essence, be more aligned on our expectations that industry will be closer to their single global development paradigm. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. Moving on to our next panelist, a few questions just came in from Dr. Lei Zhang. And here is the first question. Why is PSA only for generics, complex generics, and hybrid drug products, but not for all generic drug products? Is there a rationale, for example, as far as complexity of the drug products?
Thank you for the question. This is a good question. We all see the benefit of this program, but we also understand the genesis of this PSA program can be tracked back to the challenges we are facing, especially by the industry, in developing complex products that to meet the regulatory requirements set by both FDA and the EMA, and also the absence of harmonized guidance on these complex products, coupled with the inherent complexity and costs associated with their development. So these all prompt the need for a program that could facilitate the concurrent discussion with both agencies early in the development process. And we also heard that this is really aimed to minimize the redundant studies or testing. And this program also was designed closely model the existing FDA pre-ANDA program, which is also focused on the complex generics and EMA scientific advice processes. We also know the PSA program involves 2 agencies and is more resource intensive compared to the existing meeting processes. So the decision was made to focus the program on complex generics and also hybrid products to manage those resources effectively, in the meantime provide the benefit. And we also heard that we did not see a large number of requests. We know each product has its own unique challenges. We encourage applicants to bring their product-specific questions to the PSA meetings, especially to reduce the duplicate studies, especially if they intend to submit the application to both agencies. You can send a request if you have a business case that this program would benefit from the concurrent discussion between the 2 agencies. And also the program is being evaluated and will evolve based on the need. We also welcome your comments on ways to make the PSA more valuable to the generic industry. And we welcome insights, as you heard from the panel discussion, on products that are mostly likely to have simultaneous submissions in both regions. And we also know besides PSA, we have alternative communication avenues to the FDA, such as pre-ANDA meetings. We also recently launched the model integrate evidence meetings or control correspondence. They are all available for applicants to engage with the FDA during their drug development. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have about 1 minute left. We'll try to get in one more question for Dr. Zhang, and this will be the final question of the Q&A panel. Does the ICH M13 guideline address the acceptance of foreign comparators in BE studies?
Oh, thank you for the question. We also heard the acceptance of the foreign comparators governed by the regional regulation, and it is out of the scope of M13A, which is mainly to harmonize the scientific and technical requirements for BE studies. However, to support the global development, and we realize the challenges industry may have, and also to help reduce the number of BE studies, the M13A include a recommendation on BE studies that they can include more than one comparator in the same study, so that one BE study may be conducted in lieu of multiple BE studies to satisfy the requirements from multiple regulatory agencies. Once the M13A is adopted by the regulatory agencies, we hope this can help to help the generic drug industry by minimizing the B studies. Thank you.
Thank you to all presenters and panelists for the great presentations and answering numerous questions that came in. It's our pleasure to introduce for closing remarks Dr. Elin Murphy, Director, Office of Generic Drugs and CEDAR FDA. Please join me to welcome Dr. Murphy.
Thank you, Captain Ford, and thank you to everyone joining us for this webinar. Supporting patient access to medications is at the root of what brings us together, FDA, EMA, Health Canada, and all of you here today. Thank you for all your continued engagement. We're grateful for these partnerships and for the ability to address global challenges and opportunities together. FDA's Generic Drug Global Affairs activities aims to attain alignment on scientific and technical recommendations for generic drugs, regulatory strengthening and reliance, partnerships, information sharing, and setting international standards. We do this in collaboration with various stakeholders such as industry, international regulatory agencies, the scientific community, and the public. And, as today's presentations highlighted, when we increase our scientific alignment and bridge our regulatory expectations for generic drug development, we can come together to harmonize standards globally. By increasing efficiency in the harmonization process, we can improve the timely authorization and availability of generic drugs. And of course, that gets us to our ultimate goal of increasing access to medicine and improving health equity. For example, you heard today about how regulatory bodies and industry can work together to converge on scientific data needed to address specific challenges on complex generic drug product development. Coming together in this way reduces the need for an applicant to conduct additional testing. By using the Parallel Scientific Advice pilot program for complex generics or hybrid medicines, FDA and EMA can align our scientific thinking on a particular drug application, ultimately accelerating market access to the drug. Through this pilot, we can expand the number of generic drug applicants that submit applications to both agencies, helping patients access even more safe, effective, and high-quality generic medicines. I'm glad you also got to hear an update on our generic drug cluster. This cluster serves as a platform for several of the world's leading regulatory agencies to facilitate harmonization through early communication and collaboration related to generic drug development. The cluster aims to establish proactive alignment on specific proposed generic drug product reviews or broader drug class issues through open communication. Cluster meetings have been instrumental in comparing and evaluating regulatory approaches, assessing similarities, and identifying differences. Regular discussions on current review challenges have led to the resolution of several regulatory obstacles to approvability. These discussions also extend to regulations and guidances under development, with regular updates shared on various topics. Involved agencies have also committed to sharing data integrity concerns at early stages, allowing for collective awareness of ongoing investigations within respective agencies. Another important aspect of the generic drug cluster is its role in anticipating and collectively discussing approaches and challenges due to emerging global regulatory issues. These global regulatory issues could be attributed to global and environmental policy changes and their impact on the generic drug supply chain, prompting the identification of and coordination of multilateral responses to emerging global issues. Our international collaborations also include regulatory convergence activities such as the ICH Harmonized Draft Guidance for Generic Drugs on Bioequivalence for Immediate Release Solid Oral Dosage Forms, M13A. Since the ICH publication in 2022, FDA put out our own draft guidance for industry and Federal Register notice to solicit public comments, as well as a webinar to help industry. We hope to see the guideline finalized this year. Most recently, the ICH Assembly endorsed a second topic to harmonize bioequivalence for modified release products. In closing, I thank you for participating in service of improving the timely authorization and availability of quality, safe, and effective generic drugs that benefit patients. My appreciation to all those who made today's event possible, especially our presenters, Kevin Blake from EMA, Scott Appleton from Health Canada, and of course our FDA colleagues Sarah Ibrahim, Lei Zhang, and Calliope Sarago, as well as our panelists Lisa Burku, Ashley Bohm, Rob Lionberger, and Lei Zhang. An extra thank you to our wonderful colleagues in CEDAR's SBIA, Captain Brenda Stoddart, Captain Ray Ford, and their entire team, who we get to work with so often, and we're so grateful. To everyone in the webinar today, we look forward to your future participation in upcoming generic drug-related events. Have a great day.
Thank you for that great closing, Dr. Murphy. We do have a few housekeeping reminders. Please remember the 14-day deadline, and that's March the 13th, to claim the certificate of attendance to support CEs for SOCA, RAPS, SQA, and ACRP. Please download the certificate immediately upon creating the certificate. Otherwise, this opportunity will be lost. Recordings will be posted in approximately 10 business days. On behalf of Cedar Small Business and Industry Assistance, we hope that you enjoyed today's presentations and found them helpful. We look forward to your presence at our next SBIA webinar. Thank you for attending, and this concludes today's webinar.